I'm setting my timer, so I don't promise not to go over, but I'll do my best. I do want to explain very quickly why I am standing here instead of this man who just talked to you, who has a lot of wisdom to speak to homelessness. But I actually have some ties to Jenks First Baptist. And I grew up at this church, not in this building, but with these people, the church. And so I feel a little bit like I came home. I saw a lot of people that know me from way younger and probably have terrible stories to tell about me. And so I hope that they're keeping them to a minimum. Anyways, but I was raised in this church and have an incredible foundation of the Lord because of the people here and the lives that they led and what they showed me. And I remember from a very young age feeling called to be a missionary. We went to Faith Week at that point in time, and I can remember the day when I felt called to go into, to be a missionary, to go into ministry. And so, growing up in GAs, I remember thinking, okay, so my options, being a female, are to become a teacher and to be a doctor, and I'm probably going to have to go far away. And looking back now, I think how ridiculous those preconceived notions were, and the things that I thought and the things that I saw were about how I was supposed to serve the people and love on people and share Jesus. And I did not get it. I didn't get that there was people in my school, probably in my church, I really didn't get that, in my town, in my home, that needed the love of Jesus. And so it took many years, and I'm a pretty stubborn person, as many of you can tell, to realize that I needed to serve here in Tulsa. And so I have been working with John 3:16 Mission since 2002 was my first summer there, and I fell in love with a group of kids that stole my heart, and I haven't been able to get it back yet. And so I will continue to be there for that until I guess that happens. I don't think it will. And I came a little bit closer to homelessness in my home about 4 years ago when I dove a little deeper in relationship with a young lady that had been in the missions program since she was 5. 4 years ago, she was 15, and she needed a place to live. She was bouncing from family member to family member a little bit, and then mainly with friends, because that was way more enjoyable to be with friends, but really needed a consistent place to be and to call home. And so she came to my house, and I think she calls it home now, and I call her my daughter, and she's lived there, like I said, for 4 years. She is 19 going on 20 and a wonderful young lady, and I'm so happy to have her in my life. But it showed me a different side of homelessness that I hope to be able to kind of express to you all today. But that's kind of my journey and why I may be standing on the stage instead of the many other experts on this topic today. So, but let's dive into, you guys are hearing some overwhelming numbers about what's going on in our city, and so I want to continue in that trend and talk about homelessness with some numbers. And so once a year, the Community Service Council here in Tulsa tries to do a count of all those who are homeless in the city of Tulsa. And so they get all the shelters, all those who work with the homeless, to do our best to count the number of homeless. So in 2014, I know the numbers for 2015 are out, I just could not get my hands on them. So 2014, they're very similar. There are 812 households that are homeless here in Tulsa, which represent 1,010 individuals. And of those individuals, they say there are 177 children who are homeless in Tulsa. I love the effort to go out and to try to count the homeless, but I will tell you that those numbers are not true, that there are many other homeless living in our city. There's an advocate, a homeless advocate in Canada who said, for every visible homeless person, there are hundreds that we do not see. For every homeless person we do not see, there's someone who is precariously housed and often suffering more than or equally to those who are living on the streets. So if you want to multiply, our 1,010 people times, a minimum of 100, that number obviously grows exponentially on the number of homeless folks that we have. And I'll kind of explain that, because when we talk about homelessness, I'm going to give you a little definition, but right now kind of visualize your typical homeless person. But the actual definition of a homeless person is an individual or a family who lacks fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence. So we can all kind of breathe easy, because that definition doesn't really seem all that scary, right? Just someone who doesn't have a house. And so as we look towards those people, that represents what those who work in the homeless, 4 different kind of categories of homeless people. So I'm going to give quick definitions and stories to go along with those. So the picture that most of you probably popped into your mind when you say homeless person is someone who we would define as chronically homeless. And so someone who's chronically homeless is an individual who has a disabling condition and has been continuously homeless for at least a year, or who has at least 4 episodes of homelessness in the last 3 years. So I have a friend named Graham, and he was living under a bridge consecutively for at least 2 years. When we met Graham, it took a lot for us to be able to build a relationship with him. He had mental illnesses and was unable to really relate to people socially. And so it took, I don't know the time length, but our pastors just talking to him to finally get him to come into the missions doors. And I remember when I first met Graham, I thought, whew, okay. But he literally couldn't hold a conversation with you. But this man had so much scripture in his heart that that's all he could speak. And he would just walk around. He had chores, and he would walk around cleaning, just quoting scripture all day long, to the point where, you feel bad about yourself. Like, I don't even know these scriptures, but he's just quoting them day after day after day. And so our counselors worked with him. And he was in our program for longer than normal, but he was in our program for a couple years. Now has a job, works at Walmart, and is living independently, and has progressed quite a bit in his social skills, and interacts with people on a daily basis, which is huge for him. But Graham would have been one of those people that we would consider as chronically homeless. Our second group of folks, which Graham kind of fell into a little bit, are those folks that are living in encampments. And there's kind of 2 different categories even within this group. But those that live in what we call soft camps, and so those are people that, have their things, but they can pick up and move at any time. And you may or may not see those homeless folks around town, but those that you don't see are those that are living in long-term encampments. And some of the video that Steve, kind of the background, were some of those encampments. But we not recently, a year or so ago, 2 years ago, I don't know, cleaned out an encampment next to the railroad tracks downtown next to the old fin tube spot. And there was, no lie, a log cabin made out of railroad ties. It had a working stove, a chimney. There was 2 gentlemen and a friend of theirs, a lady who was living in this literal log cabin. For 2, maybe 3 years, they had been there. And we had to come in, and we gave them, a week or 2 weeks to move their belongings, but the people who owned the property wanted them to leave. And so they had to literally leave what was their home. They had been there for several years, overnight, just kind of clean it up and go. And they've since moved on to another city. And obviously that's the struggle with those who live in encampments. They're not on property that they own, but they are living in what is their home. Some of them have lived there, and we have not even found probably for upwards of 5 years. And so when you go knocking on their tents or their log cabin, that's their home, just like your home is their home. So the third category of folks is what we call situationally homeless. And so those are individuals who have faced some sort of housing, healthcare, financial, job crisis, where, when homeless services are provided, they're usually able to bounce back a little bit quicker. So they're typically homeless for less than a year. I have a friend named Tina, and she is a great example of kind of situationally homeless, but she served in the military, And during wartime, she never saw war, but she came back with PTSD just from trauma that she experienced from her commanding officers. She came back to Tulsa. Within 2 weeks, she was homeless because of the PTSD and just this feeling of loneliness that they talked about. And she had served her country, and bad things still happened to her, and she needed to escape. And so she began to use every drug that she could find, and she was on the streets and then experienced a different kind of abuse day after day after day, and was on our doorstep, and we were able to see her decline, and sometimes our ministering to her was calling an ambulance because she needed help. She needed medical treatment. Sometimes it was come on in, have a meal. Sometimes she would come to Bible study. And over a few months' time, as she grew tired and weary of that lifestyle and had more and more hurt and pains, she began to find a need for Christ. And through Bible study and through our chapels and through literally just meals and relationships, she was able to find Christ. She's now married, has a job, back living in an apartment. But she was homeless technically for less than a year, and we were able to help her on that path, or at least watch her as she went on that journey. The last group of homeless, and these are, those that are in encampments are the ones that are impossible to count, but this group is even more impossible to count. And those are my homeless friends that we call couch surfing, and that's kind of where my daughter was at. She, would live with friends, live in motel. She didn't live in motels, but a lot of times they'll jump from motel to motel, just very short term, wherever they can go to try to find a place just to have overnight. I have a young man right now who just graduated from Webster High School. He's been in the missions youth program for more years than I probably want to count. And his mother lost housing. And so instead of following her to shelters, he's a likable guy. He has a lot of friends. And so he has spent nearly his junior and his senior year of high school living on the couches of friends. And he is wherever they live in the city, and he takes the city bus to and from school every day, and pretty much, providing for himself as a young man who's still in high school. So as you can see, there is a wide variety of folks when we start talking about homelessness that we have to kind of encapsulate. Every person, even in these different categories, has a totally different story of their own, and so the services that they need to help get them from where they are at to living independently and on their own have so much variety that there's no way John 3:16 Mission or any other agency can just do that, provide all of those services. So I want to talk to you a little bit about some misconceptions, and then I'm going to quickly get on to what we need to do to work on helping our homeless friends. So when we talk about the homeless, I have a little bit of a temper perhaps, but I get a little agitated when people start lumping people together who are homeless. And one thing that I really dislike is when they assume that every single homeless person is an addict. That's absolutely not true. A lot of times, substance abuse and alcoholism come from living on the streets. Sometimes that is the cause of their homelessness. But that does not mean that every single person that walks into John 3:16 Mission has an addiction problem. The Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services reported that 38% of homeless folks were dependent on alcohol, and 26% abused other drugs. So even if you add those together, we're still talking about a large portion that are not addicted to drugs. Not all homeless people have mental illnesses. Mental illnesses are a big part of what we do and how we care for the homeless. But that does not mean that everyone who walks in our doors has a mental illness. In fact, the National Coalition for Homelessness reports that only 20 to 25% of the homeless have a mental illness. And that doesn't mean that not all of them need counseling, because I am a believer that we all need counseling. We all have things to work through and whatnot. But the mental illness piece, a severe mental illness, is not something that is consistent for everyone who is homeless. Not all homeless are unemployed. There are a lot of homeless that stay the night at the shelter at John 3:16 Mission who work. That may mean that they're working a job that they're just not making enough money to pay their bills and to keep a roof over their head. That may mean that their other life choices have left them with consequences that they're having to pay back and having to deal with those things. But my homeless friends have jobs and they work, and for heaven's sakes, they are not lazy. My homeless friends are probably the most creative and hardworking people that I know. I could go on and tell you a lot of stories, but they work hard. If nothing else, it is hard work being homeless. The things that you experience, the trauma that you experience every day of the elements, carrying your things with you everywhere that you go, the loneliness, the abuse. Last summer we had people that are actually out perpetrating to commit crimes against the homeless. I mean, these are things that they're dealing with on a day-to-day basis. And so they are not lazy, they are hardworking, and they often just have barriers in getting on their feet. So let's talk about what we need to do about it as the church and as a faith-based community. I want to give you just a little moment to breathe after all of that, but we've kind of already talked about it, but I don't know if you know this or not, but God is already at work. God is at work in the lives of the homeless. God is at work in downtown Tulsa, in the encampment. He is there, he is present. And so we get to take a little bit of deep breath, and I have to remind myself of that a lot, like God's got this, okay. We can handle this because we know that he's powerful and that he loves and cares for them far more than I do. And so I hear a lot of times, we want to bring Christ, we want to show them Christ, and I'm like, listen, they can tell you more about this Jesus guy than I probably know already. And they trust him. I'm not saying that all of them have a relationship with him, but I'm telling you he exists there. And so for that I am grateful. We talked a lot about definitions and who the homeless are not, but let's talk a little bit about who they are. I also, like I said, I have a lot of soapboxes I can get on, but sometimes we use these names as we talk about folks. I've done it in this conversation, but we call them the homeless. We call them addicted. We call them ex-convicts or at risk or poor or mentally ill. But as believers, I think the first step in us helping them is to take away those names that we're calling them and to start calling them our brothers, our sisters, our friends, our family members, our daughters, our sons. And we have to start looking at them like Jesus looks at them. Because as we see them as the homeless, there's already a wall there. But you know what? If I see them as my friend, then there's already something. There's room for us to work and room for us to grow. But what do we do with our friends? We talk to our friends. And so oftentimes that is our first step or our second step. If we're going to see them as our friends, then our second step is to talk to them. We get a lot of calls about people. We're not sure how to help this person, but a lady from Jenks called last summer and was like, there's this lady in the Walmart parking lot. I think she's homeless. Can you come and help her? So the guy answering the phone was like, okay, well, what's her name? Have you talked to her? And her response was, talk to her. Yes, talk to her. Talk to her. Find out her name. Find out her story. Does she want help? Is she really homeless? We don't know. We're just assuming a lot. So talk to her. And I think that's the same thing as we, there's always the question in our city, I feel like, is only growing in those that are panhandling and asking us for our resources, our money, the things. And so my first thing that I always tell people is if you have the time, talk to them, ask them their name, ask them their story. I'm not saying open up your wallet or give them the coat off their back, but at least find out who they are and their story. Because I promise you, if the Holy Spirit is working and living in you, he will tell you how to help them. The mission has a resource, and we have a box full of these cards on our table, and they're called compassion cards. If you talk to them and you are just left like, I don't know how to help, I don't know what to do, then the compassion card is exactly what you need. So I carry them in my wallet, in my car, but we guarantee, the mission will guarantee, promise you, that if someone has one of these cards and calls us and says, hey, I have a compassion card, I need food, I need a place to stay, we will come pick them up from wherever they are in the Tulsa metro area. We will bring them back. We will give them a warm meal. If they're eligible to stay in our shelters, we will help them stay in our shelter. If not, we will help resource them and get them to another shelter. Lean on us, lean on the mission to help you, but you have to talk to them first, and you have to be their friend. And there's no simple solution. I told you all the complicated things and all the different categories of the homeless, but there are a million things that they need to help, but God has given it to us to help them. But when we bring them into our family, then we will be able to help them. So my last thing is, but when we do things as a church, we typically do things for people, and we like to do things to people. We do not like to do things with people. Doing things with people is the hardest part. But I don't know if you've read your Bible lately, but that's exactly what Christ did. When he came and he worked with the disciples, he worked with them. He didn't do things for them. He taught them how to do them. And so I have two more stats. But as churches help and they do outreach, 51.5% of churches in the United States have programs that give away food. 31.9% help with housing, 20% help with clothing. That's doing things, and the mission does it. And there is a time and a place for that, and sometimes we need to give those things. But if we're going to start doing things with people, then maybe we need to start thinking outside of the box. My Friends at Jobs for Life, it's a national program, should say that 1.9% of churches are helping people find work. And I can tell you the solution for poverty, and it's employment, and it's good-paying jobs. And so if the church would flip the script, and 51.5% of churches would help with job programs and help them find employment and work with them and walk with them and bring them into the family, the problems that we see are going to go drastically down. But my thing that I want to leave us with, because I know I told you I was going to go over time, is that we have to start seeing those that we're helping as our friends. And so I often call them my friends. Like, I was just looking at our posters out there, and I'm like, there's my friend Clarence. If you haven't been downtown to the mission, you should come, and I'll introduce you to my friend Clarence. But he's been outside the mission for 5 years. We haven't figured out how to get him in the doors yet, but he's going to be my friend until we do. And so that's what I would leave you with, is to call those that you're helping your friends.